Hello everyone, my name is Xiomaro and welcome to Battlerite Sage. Today we're going to be talking about juking and baiting. First of all, what is juking and baiting? In general, when we talk about baiting in Battlerite, you're trying to force an enemy to use their mobility or counter. You might do that by fake casting, missing on purpose, or using a gap closer and then not attacking right away. Juking is somewhat similar to baiting, but it has a more specific meaning. It's essentially a fancy way of dodging an ability. Let's say Jade is charging up her snipe, and you make it look like you're going to dodge to the left, but at the last second you move to the right and avoid it. Let's start out with juking. It's simple in concept, but the execution is a little bit more intricate. It sounds easy, right? Someone charges up an ability on you, and you just change direction at the last second. Well, yes, but what about when enemies start to predict the change of direction? Then the juker becomes the jukee. How you juke depends entirely on the rank you're playing at. It sounds a little harsh, but around bronze and silver you can probably just change direction at the last second, and most people will just fall for it every time. But the good news is, if you are in silver and you're looking for that extra boost into gold, if you haven't already learned to juke people, now might be a good time to start learning. Around platinum is when people start to really understand juking, and it's almost expected that your enemy will change direction right before a charged shot. And this is where the mind games begin. I don't know about anyone else, but if you're around platinum or higher, do you ever find yourself missing snipes on lower ranked people because you expect them to dodge the snipe, but they don't? If you almost always play against people who try to juke you, you start to predict the juke and change your aim to compensate. But when someone doesn't even try to dodge it, it really throws you off. And this could be used to your advantage. If you always change direction at the last second, people can predict that and start to compensate. So this is where you need to start changing things up. Sometimes you shouldn't juke. If the last two shots you've changed direction at the last second, they'll start to predict that for the third time. So the third time, you don't change direction. Like I said, it really depends on the level you're playing at. At Diamond and Champion, when you predict someone's movement and they just stop dead, that's the weirdest thing to deal with. So sometimes that can be a really valid tactic if you're at a high rank. But if you try that in bronze and you just stop dead, you're probably just going to get nailed in the face. So try to observe your opponent's habits and adapt to that. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to give you a definitive guide on how to juke. All you can do is just understand what it means and start trying it out. The truth of the matter is, every opponent will be different, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The best advice for a beginner to juking is to get in the habit of not casting anything when you hear a snipe charging up. Start moving perpendicular to where the snipe is coming from, and then switch direction a little bit before the snipe goes off. 1v1s are by far the best way to practice this, so if you don't mind going into duel mode, that might be a good place to start. Next, let's talk about baiting. The concept of baiting is a little more complex, but once you understand it, the execution is exactly the same as juking. As I said before, baiting usually means trying to bait out a counter or other defensive ability. So let's focus on two abilities. Counters are one of the most common defensive abilities, so let's start with that. If you play a champion with a counter, you'll know that getting your counter hit is super important. If you're a ranged or a support champion, your counter is likely a defensive ability that is strongly linked to your survivability. And if you're a melee champion, your counter is often one of your gap closers. So from the opposite perspective, not hitting counters is really important too. Much like with juking, how you bait a counter will depend on your rank. At lower ranks, people will often counter very early, so all you have to do is purposefully miss your first few shots, or if you're a melee, use a gap closer and don't attack for a second. As you get to higher ranks, people know you'll try to avoid their counter, so they'll try to use it at a less predictable time. One trick you can use as Jade, Destiny, or Esmo and a bunch of other characters is charge up your right click while aiming at the person whose counter you want to bait, and then at the last second switch to someone else who doesn't have a counter. This is good in two ways. You might get the opponent to use their counter unsuccessfully, and you'll hit one of their teammates. You'll often see rooks do something like this with their charge as well. They'll start by aiming at one opponent, and then they'll start the charge and quickly change direction to another person. Almost every champion has an ability or two that doesn't trigger counters, and you can use this to your advantage when you expect one. For example, Freya's E ability doesn't trigger counters. So what you can often do is use a gap closer and then use your E ability instead of a mouse 1 with no worries about triggering the counter. People will start to expect this though, so eventually you might have to start closing the gap and then hit them once and then use your E ability. And this is where the mind games start again. For a full list of what does and doesn't trigger counters, I'll leave a link in the description. It's a little outdated because it was made pre-Alicia, but Alicia's Mouse 1 and Mouse 2 trigger counters, nothing else does, so it's quite simple with her. So let's move on to another ability that you'll want to bait. Paloma's Fear. The fear only triggers after you try to use an ability, and the spell block has a very short duration, so all you have to do is get close and then not attack right away. But what if Paloma doesn't try to fear you right away? This is another situation where you have to learn to read your opponent. A lot of lower rank Palomas, if they get jumped by a Raygon or something, they just panic and use their fear straight away, so that's quite easy to predict. In that case, all you have to do is close the gap and then wait for a second. The problem for Paloma is, if you don't trigger the fear, she's in a very bad situation. So good Palomas usually won't use it right away. So often you end up in this awkward poke battle with her. You move in, you hit her once, you move away, you move back in again, you wait a second, and it just goes on like that. And trust me, as a Paloma main, it's just as frustrating for me as it is for you. So, like with the abilities that don't trigger counters, you can abuse some iframes against Paloma's Fear. Rook's right click and Freya's E are great abilities to use against Paloma, because while you're in the air, you won't get hit by the fear. There are a lot of other defensive abilities like Reflect, but honestly, the counterplay to it is very similar to the way that you deal with counters. But the most important thing is, after you successfully bait an ability, focus them. Like, seriously, focus them really hard. Before every game starts, make a mental note of what abilities you need to bait. And once they're down, just go crazy. For example, if Bako or Raygon's Reflect is down, they've got nothing, so just go to town. Or when Blossom's Hop and Gust are down, she's very vulnerable. When Shifu's Fleetfoot, Javelin, Counter, Incap, okay, who am I kidding? Shifu always has an out. Only kidding. Kinda. Seriously though, every character has a time period where they're vulnerable. Being able to bait those key defensive abilities and then punish them for it is one of, if not the most important skills to develop in Battlerite. And the best way to get started is to just get out there and start trying it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please feel free to subscribe for more Battlerite guides, news and discussion. Until next time, thank you for watching and I'll see you soon.